This is the story of Alexander, a man who lost everything and found new meaning through grace, a humble girl who changed his life forever. Their journey of love, redemption, and second chances will touch your heart. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications to stay updated on more inspiring stories. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's dive in. Alexander Rhodes sat at the edge of his grand penthouse in Manhattan, staring out over the city that had once been the backdrop to his life of luxury and success. But now, the view was nothing more than a blur of lights. The once bustling city felt empty to him, just as his life felt hollow. His hand absent-mindedly traced the rim of his glass, the ice cubes inside clinking, as if mocking him. He was alone, yet his wealth surrounded him. Cars, jewelry, art, things that once defined him, things that now felt irrelevant. A year ago, everything had seemed perfect. Alexander had it all: the fortune, the mansion, and Isabella, his stunning wife. They had been the envy of everyone who knew them. But that dream came crashing down the moment the doctor had uttered those fateful words. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rhodes. You're infertile." Those words shattered his identity, crushed his hopes, and turned his life upside down. He couldn't have children. The very thing he had taken for granted, the legacy he had imagined building, was now out of his reach. Isabella's response had been swift. She had wanted a family, a future that included children, and Alexander could no longer offer her that. She left him, packing her bags and disappearing without a second thought, taking with her the future he had imagined. The pain of her betrayal, her departure, cut deeper than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the loss of her, it was the loss of everything he had built his life around. As the days stretched into weeks and then into months, Alexander sank deeper into despair. The bustling city seemed cold and distant. His friends and business associates had all but vanished, too consumed by their own lives to notice his descent. The once grand parties and social gatherings felt meaningless now, a facade of a life he no longer cared for. His business was thriving, but what was success without someone to share it with? The answer came to him each time he lay awake at night: nothing. In an attempt to escape, Alexander retreated to one of his vacation homes along the coast. The beach had always been a place of peace for him, the sound of the waves calming his racing mind. The home was isolated, far from the distractions of New York. It was here, in this quiet, that he hoped to find himself again. But all he found was loneliness. One morning, feeling the weight of his thoughts bearing down on him, Alexander decided to take a ride on his jet ski. The water called to him, promising a brief moment of freedom. He tore across the ocean, feeling the wind in his face and the thrill of the speed, but the fleeting joy was soon replaced by a sense of emptiness. The engine sputtered, then failed completely. Stranded in the middle of the open sea, Alexander felt the familiar weight of hopelessness creeping in. The waves tossed his jet ski helplessly, and for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to feel vulnerable. Hours passed, and exhaustion began to take its toll. He was alone. No one would come for him. The thoughts that plagued him, his infertility, his failed marriage, his empty existence, began to swallow him whole. He drifted aimlessly, the vastness of the ocean reflecting the vast emptiness inside him. In that moment, he considered giving up, letting the sea take him away from everything. But just as the last of his strength was fading, the jet ski was carried by the current toward the shore. He had no strength left to fight. The ocean had made its decision. The beach was deserted, the waves gently lapping against the shore, when Grace Turner noticed something unusual washed up on the sand. At first, she thought it was debris from the storm, perhaps a piece of driftwood or some forgotten object lost to the sea. But as she approached, she saw the form of a man lying motionless on the sand. Grace's heart raced as she hurried toward him. She had lived in this small coastal village all her life, and while she was accustomed to helping fishermen bring in their catch or serving tourists in the local cafe, she had never encountered someone like him. His clothes were expensive, a sharp contrast to the worn simplicity of the village. His face, however, was pale and devoid of life, as though the sea had claimed him for its own. "Hey, are you all right?" she called out, kneeling beside him. There was no response, and panic bubbled up inside her. Without a second thought, she ripped open her backpack, pulling out a bottle of water. She splashed a little onto his face, hoping to rouse him. After a moment, his eyes fluttered open, disoriented and gasping for air. "Where? Am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse. "You're on the beach," Grace said, her voice firm yet gentle. "I'm going to help you. Stay with me." She helped him sit up, though he seemed too weak to do much for himself. Grace didn't know who he was, but she wasn't going to leave him alone. His chest heaved, and his hands trembled as he tried to steady himself. "Can you walk?" she asked. He nodded faintly, but his legs gave way, and Grace caught him before he could collapse. "Come on," she said softly, her arm around his waist as she supported his weight. "I'll take you to my father's place. He's a fisherman. We'll get you some help." With surprising strength, Grace guided him across the beach, her father's modest wooden house coming into view. It was a humble place, but it was home. She helped him inside, laying him down on the couch while her father, a weathered man with strong hands and a kind face, took over. Over the next few days, Grace's father, John, tended to Alexander's injuries with care, while Grace made him simple meals. Despite being a stranger, Alexander was taken aback by their kindness. No one had ever cared for him like this before. The isolation he had sought in his retreat from New York had turned into something far more profound. The Turners, despite their humble lifestyle, had something he had lost: human connection. The quiet days passed in a haze. Grace spoke little, but her presence was constant. She was a dreamer, full of hope, despite the tough life she had inherited from her father's hard work. Her stories about wanting to see the world beyond the small village, about her aspirations to do something bigger than wait tables or help her father with fishing, captivated him. She was not like the women he had known in New York, chasing after wealth, status, and perfection. Grace was genuine, and that truth drew him in. On the fourth day, when Alexander had regained enough strength to sit up, Grace offered to drive him back to his vacation home. She insisted they use the old buggy her father had fixed up, a rickety vehicle that seemed unlikely to make it far. Alexander had no choice but to accept, though the idea of returning to the emptiness of his mansion weighed heavily on his heart. The buggy jolted along the dusty roads, Grace at the wheel. They talked more during the journey, their conversation flowing easily. Alexander felt himself laughing, something he hadn't done in months. As the buggy rattled along, he realized how much he wanted to stay in this place, to remain close to her. "You know," Alexander began, "this place is a lot more peaceful than I thought it would be." Grace smiled, her eyes twinkling with the simple joy of sharing a moment with him. "It's peaceful, yes, but sometimes I think I'm meant for more than this. I dream of a life beyond this village. Maybe one day I'll see the world." The words struck a chord deep within him. He had once dreamed of big things too, but now he was lost. And somehow, Grace's dream seemed to awaken something inside him. She was looking for more, and though it seemed improbable, he wondered if maybe he had a place in that dream. As they approached his home, the mansion looming on the horizon, he turned to her and offered something unexpected. "Let me fix your buggy for you," he said. "Consider it a thank you for your kindness." Grace blinked in surprise. "You don't have to do that, but thank you." Alexander watched her, his heart swelling. She had no idea, but in that moment, he knew he was looking for more too. The next few days passed in a gentle rhythm. Alexander stayed at the Turner's house, his mind slowly shifting from the sterile, lonely existence he had left behind in New York to the quiet, simpler life of the village. Grace and her father's daily routines, though humble, were filled with a kind of purpose he had long forgotten. Grace's father, John, was kind and welcoming, offering Alexander stories about the sea, about the village, and about the hardships that came with their way of life. He treated Alexander not as a rich, broken man, but as a person, a fellow human being who had found his way to their doorstep. Grace continued to work as a waitress at the local cafe, but she never seemed to mind. She dreamed of something greater, of leaving the small town to see the world, to find a life that didn't tie her down. Alexander found himself captivated by her spirit, her resilience. The more he listened to her, the more he realized that her strength wasn't just in her dreams. It was in her heart. One evening, when Alexander had regained most of his strength, Grace offered to take him back to his vacation home. They both knew the time was coming for him to leave, but neither of them seemed ready to part ways. As they drove through the winding roads, the stars beginning to twinkle above, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't want to let go. "I'll fix your buggy," he said again, more out of a desire to keep the connection alive than for any practical reason. Grace's eyes softened, a smile tugging at her lips. "You really don't have to, you know?" But Alexander could tell by the way she said it that she appreciated it. And maybe, just maybe, she appreciated him. The thought made his chest tighten with something unspoken, something he wasn't yet ready to name. The night ended with a long embrace before Alexander left, the warmth of her presence lingering long after he had driven away. He wasn't sure where their connection would lead, but he knew one thing. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir within him, a sense of hope, a sense of belonging. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself thinking about Grace constantly. Her smile, the way she cared for him, and the passion in her eyes when she spoke about her dreams, all of it stayed with him long after he left the Turner household. He had returned to his vacation home by the coast, but the mansion felt as cold and empty as it always had. In contrast, Grace's world, though modest, had a warmth to it, a sense of purpose that was missing from his life. He couldn't shake the feeling that his time with her had sparked something in him, a desire to be better, to be part of something real. Every day, he found himself growing more restless, counting the hours until he could return to the village. A week after their first farewell, Alexander called Grace. His voice, always confident in business meetings and social events, now carried an unfamiliar tenderness. He asked her to meet him at the local cafe, the place where she worked. When Grace saw him waiting outside, a smile spread across her face, and for a moment, it felt as though time stood still. She wasn't expecting him, but somehow it felt like she had been waiting. "You didn't have to come all this way," Grace said, her voice light but laced with curiosity. "I'm happy to see you, though." Alexander smiled, the distance between them feeling suddenly much smaller than before. "I wanted to see you again," he said simply. And the sincerity in his words made her heart skip a beat. They spent the afternoon together, talking about everything and nothing at all. As they walked along the beach, the sand between their toes, Alexander realized that something inside him had shifted. It wasn't just gratitude for her kindness, nor was it merely attraction. He admired her strength, her unwavering belief in something better. Grace had shown him what life could be like without the weight of materialism and status, and he found himself yearning for it. Later that evening, before parting, Alexander found himself asking something he had never imagined saying before. "Would you ever consider coming to New York with me?" he asked. Grace paused, her heart racing. She hadn't expected such an offer. "New York? I don't know. I mean, it's so far from everything I've known." "I know it's a big step," Alexander said, his voice earnest. "But I'm serious. I want you in my life, Grace. I want to help you make your dreams come true." The words hung in the air between them. Grace studied him, unsure what to make of the sudden shift in their relationship. She had always dreamed of something bigger, but New York? It seemed so far from everything she had ever known. She felt torn between the pull of the life she had imagined and the growing connection between them. I don't know what to say," she admitted softly, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "It's a lot to think about." Alexander nodded, understanding. "I'm not asking for anything right away. I just wanted you to know that the offer is there. I'll give you time. But no matter what, I want you to know you have a place in my life." Grace smiled, her heart fluttering in her chest. "Thank you, Alexander. I need time to figure things out, but I'm glad you came." They hugged, lingering for a moment longer than either of them expected. When they pulled away, their eyes met, and for the first time, Alexander felt a deep sense of certainty. He had come to this village to escape his past, but in doing so, he had found a future that, for the first time in a long while, seemed worth fighting for. The days that followed were filled with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. Alexander knew his time with Grace was running out. He had to return to New York to handle some pressing business matters, but he found it hard to leave. Every conversation with Grace, every moment spent together, made him feel like he was slowly discovering a new version of himself, one that wasn't defined by wealth or status, but by real connections, by real people. When the day to leave came, Grace drove him to the small airport. As the plane took off, Alexander watched the coastline fade into the distance, his mind heavy with thoughts of Grace. He hadn't expected to feel this way, so attached, so invested in someone who lived such a different life from his own. But there it was. Back in New York, the bustling city seemed even more suffocating than before. The noise, the traffic, the endless rush, it all felt foreign now. Every meeting, every call felt disconnected from the man he was becoming. He found himself counting the days until he could return to the village, to Grace. Over the next few weeks, they stayed in touch, daily calls, messages, and sometimes long emails. Their conversations, often about trivial things, became the highlight of his day. She shared stories of life in the village, of her father's fishing trips, and the small joys of working in the cafe. She spoke about her dreams of seeing the world beyond the small town. And Alexander listened, genuinely interested, genuinely moved by her vision. In turn, he shared snippets of his life in New York, his business dealings, the occasional celebrity sighting, the overwhelming loneliness that always seemed to linger beneath it all. He knew that his wealth, his status, meant little to Grace, and that made him appreciate her even more. She had shown him a side of life he had long forgotten, the beauty of simplicity, the joy of connection, the power of love. Every night as he lay in his plush apartment staring at the skyline, his mind wandered back to Grace. He realized that his wealth meant nothing compared to the warmth she had brought into his life. The life he had once thought of as perfect now felt hollow without her. Finally, after weeks of longing, Alexander made the decision. He would return to the village, no matter the cost. He had found something in Grace that he had never known in his wealth, something worth more than all the money in the world. Just as Alexander was preparing for his trip back to the village, an unexpected call from Grace shook him to his core. "Alexander, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling. "I've been feeling strange, and I think I need to see a doctor." Panic gripped Alexander's heart. He immediately booked the earliest flight to the village, his mind racing with worries. What could be wrong? Was she sick? Was something wrong with the baby? When he arrived, Grace was at the small clinic, sitting nervously in the waiting room. The doctor had run a few tests, and he was waiting for the results. Alexander paced outside the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't known how much he cared about Grace until this moment. His thoughts raced. What would he do without her? Finally, the doctor emerged, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Rhodes," he said, "Grace has some news for you. It's important." Grace stood up, her face pale, but her eyes shining with something indescribable. "Alexander, I'm pregnant," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander froze. The words didn't register at first. He blinked, unable to believe what he had just heard. He had spent so long feeling inadequate, unsure of his ability to create a family of his own. And yet here she was, telling him she was pregnant. The doctor continued, "There's more. You're going to be a father of twins." The shock hit Alexander like a wave. He staggered back, barely able to process the information. Twins? He had been told he was infertile. He could never have children. Yet, here it was, the unexpected, the impossible, all unfolding before him. Tears filled his eyes as he reached for Grace's hand. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel broken. He felt whole. The future that had once seemed so out of reach, so impossible, was suddenly within his grasp. Grace, his strength, his hope, had given him everything he had ever dreamed of, and more. He vowed to protect her, to protect their children, with everything he had. For the first time, Alexander Rhodes understood what it truly meant to have a family, and nothing would ever take that away from him. The days following the doctor's revelation were a blur of emotions. Alexander found himself grappling with the weight of the news, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. The idea of becoming a father had always seemed distant, even impossible. But now, it was a reality, and the thought of it filled him with a profound sense of purpose. Twins. 2 children, his children, were on their way. Grace's pregnancy brought a new rhythm to their lives. The quiet village that had once felt so far removed from Alexander's world became the center of his universe. He stayed by Grace's side, helping with her appointments and making sure she had everything she needed. Her strength and resilience amazed him, and he marveled at how someone so grounded could make him feel so rooted. Despite the initial shock, the two of them grew closer. Grace's joy became his joy, and her hopes for the future mirrored his own. She dreamed of a life filled with love, peace, and the freedom to explore. Alexander, too, began to dream in ways he hadn't before. He thought about raising their children here, in this quiet, simple town where they could experience the world in ways that didn't involve the pressures of his old life. Though Grace's father, William, had always been warm and welcoming, their bond deepened as he saw the way Alexander cared for his daughter. The older man had his doubts at first, unsure if someone like Alexander could ever understand the life they led. But as the days passed, he saw the genuine transformation in Alexander, a man who, in so many ways, was learning what it meant to live with purpose and heart. Grace's dreams of adventure were still alive in her, but now they began to shift. She had once imagined traveling the world, seeing exotic places, but now she dreamt of showing her children the beauty of the world around them. She wanted them to grow up in a place where nature thrived, where the simple joys of life could be found in every day. Alexander knew he would have to split his time between the village and New York, but he no longer felt torn. His heart was with Grace and their growing family. He was ready to embrace this new chapter, knowing that it wasn't about the wealth he had accumulated, but about the love and family he was building. The day they decided to marry was the beginning of their new life together. They had always talked about it, but now it felt more real than ever. Grace wore a simple white dress, her beauty enhanced by the glow of her pregnancy, and Alexander stood beside her, his love for her written clearly in his eyes. The ceremony was held in the village, surrounded by their closest family and friends. William proudly gave his daughter away, and as the sun set over the ocean, Alexander realized he had found something far more precious than anything he could have ever dreamed of: his home, his heart, his family. The arrival of their twin sons, Joshua and Jacob, was a moment of pure joy and chaos. The small coastal house was suddenly filled with laughter, cries, and the constant bustle of caring for newborns. Alexander, who had once been overwhelmed by the demands of his business empire, now found himself fully immersed in the daily routines of fatherhood. He marveled at how two tiny beings could completely change the landscape of his life. Every time he held them in his arms, he felt a love so deep, so overwhelming, that it almost brought him to tears. It was a love he had never known, and it made every sacrifice, every sleepless night, worth it. But parenthood wasn't without its challenges. The constant feeding, the late-night cries, and the unpredictable nature of newborns tested their patience. Alexander struggled to find balance between caring for Grace and the twins and managing his responsibilities in New York. He couldn't afford to neglect his business, but he also couldn't bear to be away from his family for too long. Grace, ever the pillar of strength, handled it all with grace. No pun intended. She was the one up in the middle of the night with the babies, soothing them when they cried, making sure they were fed and comfortable. And yet, even in the midst of exhaustion, she never complained. Her love for their children filled every corner of their home, and Alexander often found himself in awe of her ability to handle it all with such calm and tenderness. They had their moments of doubt, of course. There were days when the weight of it all felt too much to bear, when the lack of sleep and the endless responsibilities seemed overwhelming. But every time Alexander looked into Grace's eyes or held one of their sons, he was reminded of why they were doing this. The love they shared, the family they were creating. It was all worth it. There were, of course, moments of joy amidst the chaos. Their first family outings, the twins' first smiles, the first time they all sat down together for a family meal. Each moment felt like a precious gift. They found joy in the little things, the way the twins cooed when they were rocked in their cradle, or the sound of Grace's laughter as she played with them in the garden. These were the moments that made life worth living. Alexander had come to realize that his wealth, his success, his past, they didn't define him anymore. His family did. His love for Grace and their children was everything. He was no longer the wealthy, lonely man he had once been. He was a father, a husband, a man whose heart was full and whose life had meaning. Just as things seemed to be settling into a rhythm, a storm from Alexander's past came crashing into their peaceful life. Elizabeth, his ex-wife, made an unexpected return. Her motives, however, were anything but innocent. Driven by jealousy, greed, and a desire for revenge, she sought to reclaim what she had lost, everything Alexander had built. She filed a lawsuit claiming she was entitled to a portion of his assets, citing their marriage and the years they had spent together. The media caught wind of the story, and soon it became a sensationalized spectacle. Journalists and paparazzi hounded Alexander, digging up every detail of his life. His business, once thriving, now found itself under scrutiny. The pressure mounted, and Alexander felt the weight of it all on his shoulders. But amid the chaos, Grace remained his rock. She never wavered in her support, even when it felt like the world was against them. Her unwavering belief in him gave him the strength to face Elizabeth's attacks head-on. With Grace by his side, Alexander confronted Elizabeth in court, where her lies were exposed for all to see. The case was dismissed, and Alexander's reputation was restored. But the battle had taken its toll. The media frenzy subsided, but the emotional scars lingered. It was in this moment of crisis that Alexander realized how much Grace had come to mean to him. She had stood by him when the world seemed intent on tearing him down. She had believed in him when everyone else doubted him. Her love, her support, these were the things that had given him the strength to fight, to stand tall, and to win. In the end, it wasn't the victory in court that mattered most. It was the strength of their bond. Together, they had weathered the storm, and their love had emerged unshaken. As they stood hand in hand, looking at the chaos behind them, Alexander realized that nothing, not even his past, could ever take away what they had built together. He had a family now, one that was strong, resilient, and full of love. That was all that truly mattered. Years had passed, and as Alexander stood by the window of their coastal home, watching his twin sons chase each other through the garden, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over him. The world had changed in ways he never could have imagined. The man he once was, the broken millionaire who had felt the emptiness of wealth without purpose, was gone. In his place stood a man rich not in money, but in love, in family, in meaning. He watched Grace as she laughed, her joy contagious, as she playfully scooped their sons into her arms, her pregnancy glow still evident even with the years that had passed. Her beauty had only deepened over time, a reflection not just of her outer radiance, but of the strength and warmth that radiated from within. He thought back to the first time he met her, the young woman who had saved his life without ever expecting anything in return. How that moment, that chance encounter on the beach, had set everything into motion. It was as if the universe had given him a second chance, a life he never thought he would have. Turning from the window, Alexander looked at the life they had built together. Their coastal home was filled with warmth, with laughter, and with memories of a love that had only grown stronger with each passing day. The mansion in New York, which had once symbolized everything he had thought he needed, no longer held the same appeal. His true wealth was here, in this simple, beautiful life they had created. With Grace by his side and their children growing before his eyes, he felt a peace he had never known in his past. Grace joined him at the window, her hand slipping into his. She stood beside him, gazing out at the setting sun, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink. It reminded him of that night when everything had changed, the night they had both realized they were meant to be. "You've given me everything I ever wanted," she said, her voice soft but full of love. Alexander smiled, pulling her gently into his arms. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, feeling the warmth of her presence fill him with gratitude. "No, Grace?" he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We did it together." In that moment, he realized just how far they had come. From the broken man who had felt abandoned by the world to the man who now stood before the woman he loved, with two sons who were the center of his universe. He had never believed in fate, but now he did. Their love was proof that life could give second chances, that redemption was possible, and that love, no matter how improbable, could heal even the deepest wounds. As they stood together, watching their sons run toward them, their laughter filling the air, Alexander knew that this was all that mattered. The stars above them began to twinkle as night began to fall, and he could almost feel the presence of those same stars from the night they had first declared their love for each other. Those stars had witnessed the birth of their journey, and now they watched as it continued to unfold, a life that was more beautiful than either of them could have ever imagined. Together, Grace whispered, resting her head on his shoulder. Forever, Alexander replied, his heart swelling with the truth of it. In the end, it wasn't the money, the mansion, or the past that defined his life. It was the family he had found. A family that had given him the one thing he could never buy, true happiness. And as he held Grace in his arms, surrounded by the love they had built, Alexander knew that every step, every struggle had been worth it. The future was theirs to shape, together, hand in hand. Their love story, born on a quiet beach, had become a testament to the power of hope, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And for the first time, Alexander understood what it meant to truly live. The story of Alexander and Grace is not just a journey from darkness to light, but a testament to the power of love, forgiveness, and the belief in something greater in life. The challenges they overcame, from the loneliness of the past to the difficulties of the present, could not break the bond between them. They found each other in what seemed like random moments, but they were, in reality, a perfect arrangement of fate. From a wealthy but empty man, Alexander became the father and husband he had always dreamed of. And Grace, the humble girl with a heart full of love, not only changed his life, but also gave him the true values he had never found in wealth or outward success. Together, they built a happy family, where love was not just words, but actions, a shared sacrifice in every moment. They created a simple yet meaningful life, where every day was a gift they cherished. Even when life tested them, their love for each other remained a steadfast anchor, helping them overcome every obstacle. Alexander was no longer the man of the past. He had found himself through love and family. Thus, their story doesn't end as the conclusion of a journey, but as the beginning of a new chapter, where love, hope, and family will always be the guiding light, leading them toward a future filled with joy and happiness. Thank you so much for staying with us throughout this journey and for taking the time to listen to the full story. We truly appreciate your support and attention as we shared the tale of Alexander and Grace, a story of love, redemption, and the power of second chances. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to show your support by hitting the like button, subscribing to our channel, and sharing it with your friends. Your likes and comments mean the world to us and help us continue creating content that we hope you love. Stay tuned for more exciting stories and updates, and thank you once again for being part of this incredible journey.